You are the first good thing that's happened to me here.
The wind hit the house at 11:52 p.m., and Malachi Reeves was already awake, already moving, already counting the seconds between the porch light flickering and the transformer down the block giving up entirely. He heard his daughter before he reached her door, not screaming, just that thin, urgent voice she used when she didn't want to admit she was scared. Zuri was 7, and she had inherited her mother's habit of being brave a beat too late. He scooped her off the bed, blanket and all, and carried her to the hallway just as the old oak between his yard and the yard next door let go of one of its heaviest limbs. It came down across the shared fence with a sound like the whole night cracking open, and for one long second the power in 3 houses died at once. In the sudden dark, Malachi heard his neighbor's back door bang open, and a voice he'd only known for 6 weeks called his name like she already had every right to. Comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. I want to know who's staying up late for this one. Now let's go back to where it started, because 6 weeks earlier, Malachi Reeves didn't know his neighbor's name, and he liked it that way. He'd built a life out of not needing much from anyone. 3 years since Danielle died, and he'd turned grief into a schedule, up at 5, Zuri to school by 7:40, a full day of contracting work, cabinets, decks, the occasional full kitchen gut, and home in time to make dinner that wasn't cereal. People in the neighborhood called him reliable. His sister called him closed. Malachi preferred reliable. He kept the yard neat, kept the fence painted, kept the 6-foot cedar boundary between his property and whoever happened to live next door in good repair, because a solid fence meant fewer conversations he didn't have the energy to start. The house next to his had sat empty for 4 months after the Garrisons moved to Charlotte, and he'd gotten used to the quiet. He told himself he preferred it. He was mostly telling the truth. The moving truck showed up on a Tuesday, which he only knew because Zuri came running through the kitchen shouting that somebody was stealing the Garrisons' old house. He corrected her, gently, the way he corrected most of her theories about the world, and went out to introduce himself the way his mother had raised him to, because a neighbor was a neighbor whether you wanted the complication or not. The woman unloading boxes from the back of a rental truck introduced herself as Margot Hale, and she had the kind of tired, determined energy of someone who had just moved 4 states in a single week and hadn't slept properly since. She was a landscape designer, she said, taking a new job with a firm downtown. She did not mention a husband, an ex, or why a landscape designer's own backyard looked like nobody had touched it in a decade. Malachi didn't ask. He carried 2 boxes marked kitchen up her porch steps and went back to his side of the fence. For the first 2 weeks, that was the whole relationship, a nod over the cedar boards, a wave if their cars left at the same time, nothing more. Malachi told himself this was exactly right. He had a daughter to raise and a business to run and no interest in becoming the kind of man who fell for the first single woman who moved in next door, because that felt less like connection and more like convenience. And he had promised himself after Danielle that he would never again mistake proximity for love. Margot, for her part, seemed just as guarded. She kept her blinds closed in the evenings. She worked in her yard alone, pulling weeds with a kind of aggression that suggested she was working out something that had nothing to do with landscaping. Malachi noticed. He noticed the way some people notice weather, passively, without meaning to, filing it away as information he had no plans to use. It was Zuri who broke the fence first, literally and otherwise. There was a loose board on the bottom row, low enough for a determined 7-year-old to wriggle through, and by the 3rd week of Margot's residency, Zuri had discovered it led directly to a yard with actual flowers in it, the first color Margot had planted since arriving. Malachi found his daughter on the wrong side of the fence on a Thursday afternoon, kneeling in the dirt beside a woman she'd known for exactly 9 minutes, both of them elbow-deep in a flower bed, laughing about something involving a garden gnome. He opened his mouth to apologize. Margot looked up first, dirt on her cheek, and said, "She has better instincts for perennials than most of my clients." That was the first time he heard her laugh properly, and it was the first time in 3 years he felt something in his chest that he didn't immediately know how to file away as nothing. He should have fixed the board that same week. He told himself he would, right after the Henderson's deck job wrapped up, right after the weather cooled down enough to make the work comfortable, right after a dozen other reasons that were really just one reason: wearing different clothes. The truth was that Suri had started asking, every single afternoon, whether she could go see Miss Margot, and Malachi had started saying yes more often than a responsible, boundaried single father probably should have. He justified it to himself in pieces. Margot was clearly good with kids, patient in a way that came from either experience or instinct, and Suri needed more women in her life who weren't relatives obligated to love her. That was the whole reason. He repeated it to himself often enough that he almost believed it covered the way he'd started finding excuses to be out in the yard at the same time she was. Their conversations lengthened without either of them agreeing to it. What started as Malachi collecting his daughter at the fence line became 15 minutes leaning against the cedar boards, talking about nothing important: her old firm in Chicago, his years learning carpentry from an uncle who used to say a house that's built right will forgive you for almost everything else. Margot admitted, in pieces over several evenings, that she'd left Chicago not for the job but because of the job's convenient distance from a 5-year relationship that had ended badly enough that she still flinched at wedding photos on other people's mantels. She didn't give him the whole story at once. She gave it to him the way a person hands over something breakable, a little at a time, watching to see if he'd drop it. He didn't. He found that he was careful with her information in a way he hadn't been careful with anything since Danielle, and that unsettled him more than it should have. Suri, meanwhile, operated with the total lack of subtlety unique to 7-year-olds on a mission. She started referring to Margot as our neighbor friend, in a tone that made clear she considered the relationship a foregone conclusion. She invited Margot to her school's fall festival before checking with her father, which put Malachi in the position of either walking back his daughter's invitation or accepting that Margot Hale was about to spend a Saturday morning surrounded by 7-year-olds and cotton candy on his behalf. He chose not to walk it back. Margot showed up in jeans and an old flannel, helped Suri win a stuffed elephant at the ring toss, and stood next to Malachi in a way that felt less like two neighbors coincidentally at the same event and more like something neither of them had a name for yet. Other parents noticed. His sister, who lived 2 towns over, texted him a single question mark after seeing a photo Suri had posted. If you've made it this far, you already know this story's going somewhere either of them was planning, and if it's got you invested already, go ahead and hit subscribe now, because chapter after chapter, this is only going to get harder to walk away from. Now back to Malachi, who was doing everything in his power to convince himself nothing had changed. The porch conversation started happening even without Suri as an excuse. Some nights, after his daughter was asleep, Malachi found himself out on his own back steps with a coffee he didn't need, and more often than not, Margot's porch light would still be on, and one of them would eventually walk to the fence just to talk. They talked about ordinary things: her clients, his current job rebuilding a stranger's crumbling deck, the particular indignity of Ohio weather in October. But underneath the ordinary things, something else was building, slow and quiet, the way water finds a crack in a foundation long before anyone notices the damage. Malachi caught himself, more than once, watching her hands while she talked, or noticing the exact moment her laugh went from polite to real. He told himself this was simple friendship. He was aware, even as he said it, that he no longer fully believed himself. The fence, still unrepaired, became something of a running joke between them. Margot started referring to the loose board as the door, as though it were an intentional architectural feature rather than a piece of cedar Malachi kept forgetting to nail back into place. "You're a contractor," she pointed out one evening, arms crossed over the top rail. "And you can't fix your own fence." He told her the truth, or most of it, that fixing the board meant admitting he liked the fact that it stayed broken, and that felt like a bigger conversation than either of them was ready to have on a Tuesday. Margot went quiet at that, the kind of quiet that meant she'd heard exactly what he'd almost said. She didn't push. She just told him, eventually, that she wasn't in any hurry for him to fix it either, and something about the way she said it made his pulse do something inconvenient. Malachi's caution had a source, and eventually he told her about it properly, sitting on his own back steps while she sat on hers, the fence between them like a low wall neither one particularly respected anymore. Danielle had died 3 years earlier, an aneurysm nobody saw coming, on an ordinary Tuesday that had started like every other Tuesday until it didn't. He told Margot about the year after, how he'd nearly lost the business, how Zuri had stopped talking for almost 2 months, how every well-meaning woman at church or the grocery store who suggested he get back out there had made him want to disappear entirely. He said he'd built a life that didn't require trusting anyone else with the parts of him that could still break, and that Zuri deserved a father who wasn't constantly bracing for another loss. Margot listened without interrupting, which he'd come to understand was rare and valuable in a person. When it was her turn, she told him about David, 5 years, an engagement ring she'd kept in a drawer for the last 11 months of it because some part of her already knew, and an ending that had less to do with betrayal than with slowly realizing she'd been building a future with someone who wanted a different version of her than the one she actually was. "He didn't leave me," she said. "I left before he could finish deciding I wasn't enough." She said it flatly, like a fact she'd made peace with, but Malachi heard the fracture underneath it anyway. He understood, suddenly and completely, why she kept her blinds closed and worked her own yard like she was punishing the dirt. They were both people who had learned to survive by expecting less. Recognizing that in her felt like recognizing it in a mirror. The tension between them stopped being subtext somewhere in early November, on a night cold enough that they should have both gone inside an hour earlier and didn't. Margot asked him, out of nowhere, whether he thought about it, them, whatever them might mean, and Malachi, who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of not answering questions like that, found he didn't want to dodge this one. "Every day since the fall festival," he admitted, and watched something in her expression loosen that he hadn't realized had been tightly held until it wasn't. "Then why does the fence still have a hole in it?" she asked, and he laughed, actually laughed, in a way that surprised them both. "Because fixing it means deciding this is real," he said. "And I wasn't sure you wanted it to be." She reached over the low rail then, not quite touching him, just close enough that the space between their hands became the only thing either of them could think about. "I moved 4 states for a fresh start," she said quietly. "And the first good thing that's happened to me here climbed through a hole in a fence holding a plastic shovel and told me I needed better flowers." Malachi covered the rest of the distance himself. The kiss was careful at first, the way both of them did most things now, but it didn't stay careful for long. When they finally broke apart, his forehead resting against hers, Margot whispered that he still owed her a fixed fence. He told her he'd get to it eventually. Neither of them believed he meant it, and neither of them minded. If you are enjoying this story, click the subscribe button. For 3 weeks after that November night, the relationship existed mostly in the space between their 2 porches, careful, contained, protected from the rest of the world by the same cedar boards that had once kept them apart. Malachi introduced Margot to Zuri as Daddy's friend, which Zuri accepted with the total lack of surprise of a child who had considered this outcome inevitable since the flower bed. They took things slow on purpose. Malachi had learned the hard way that grief made people rush toward anything that felt like relief, and he refused to let this become that. A shortcut around loneliness instead of something built to last. Margot, still not fully unpacked from her last relationship in more ways than the literal boxes still stacked in her spare room, agreed without needing convincing. They spent evenings on porches, Saturdays at Zuri's soccer games, and let the thing between them grow at the pace of something that intended to stay. The storm arrived on a Friday in early December, forecast as routine and arriving as anything but. Malachi had been out on a job until late, wrapping a deck rebuild before the weather turned, and Margot had offered to keep Zuri fed and settled until he got home. Not the first time, not even the 5th, but the first time she'd be doing it alone through actual severe weather. The wind picked up around 9. By 10:30, the sky had gone the particular greenish color that made every long-time Midwesterner's stomach drop, and the power flickered twice before Malachi's truck even made it into the driveway. He found Margot and Zuri in the hallway with flashlights and blankets, Zuri wide-eyed but working hard to look brave, exactly the way her mother used to. The oak came down at 11:52, the same moment the transformer failed for good. It took the heaviest limb clean off and dropped it directly across the shared fence line, splitting the cedar boards Malachi had never gotten around to fixing straight down the middle. For one disorienting second, in total darkness, all Malachi could think about was Zuri's face and whether the tree had hit any part of either house. It hadn't. The limb had fallen precisely into the 6 feet of space between the two back porches, close enough to rattle windows, far enough to do no real damage beyond the fence itself. Margot's voice found him in the dark before his flashlight did, already moving toward his door, already asking if Zuri was all right before she'd even confirmed it herself. That was when it landed on him, fully and without argument. This was not convenience. This was not proximity mistaken for love. This was a woman who, in the middle of a genuine emergency, ran toward his daughter without being asked. They spent the rest of the storm together in Malachi's living room, candles lit, Zuri eventually asleep between them on the couch with the specific boneless trust of a child who felt completely safe. Malachi and Margot talked in low voices over her head for 2 hours while the wind settled outside, about nothing consequential and everything that mattered. How strange it was that the fence had finally broken all the way, how either of them particularly wanted to rebuild it exactly as it had been. "Maybe we don't put it back," Margot said quietly, watching the candlelight instead of him. "Maybe we build a gate instead." Malachi understood, the way he'd come to understand most of what she said lately, that she wasn't only talking about lumber. If this story's got your chest doing something right now, that's exactly the point. And if you want more nights like this one, chapter after chapter, subscribing helps more than you'd think. Because what came next wasn't the easy part. It rarely is. The morning after the storm brought clarity, and clarity brought fear, not of Margot, but of how much room she'd already taken up in a life Malachi had spent 3 years carefully rationing. Watching her care for Zuri during the worst of the storm hadn't felt like a test passed. It had felt like proof that he was already further than he'd let himself admit, and that terrified him more than the storm had. He built his whole rebuilding process around control, around never again being caught unprepared by how much losing someone could cost. Margot, watching him go quiet over the following days, recognized the retreat immediately, because she'd done the same thing herself more than once. She didn't chase him. She'd learned that lesson already, the hard way, with David. She simply waited, on her side of a fence that no longer fully stood, for him to decide what he actually wanted. The distance lasted 11 days, which was 11 days too long by both their private counts. Malachi buried himself in work, taking on an extra job 2 towns over that kept him gone past dinner most nights, telling himself Zuri needed the income more than she needed him around. It was a lie built out of an older, truer fear, that the closer he let Margot get, the more it would cost him if he ever lost her too. He knew, somewhere underneath the busyness, that he was doing exactly what his sister had once accused him of, treating distance like proof of maturity, when really it was just fear wearing a more respectable coat. Zuri noticed before he did. She asked, 3 separate times that week, why Miss Margot didn't come over anymore, and each time Malachi gave her an answer that satisfied neither of them. Margot, for her part, spent those 11 days doing what she always did when a relationship started slipping sideways, working obsessively in her yard, as though enough physical labor could substitute for the conversation she was too afraid to force. She'd promised herself, after David, that she would never again wait quietly on the sidelines while someone else decided whether she was worth the risk. But this felt different, and she knew it, because Malachi wasn't disappearing out of indifference. He was disappearing out of the same fear she recognized in her own reflection. Still, recognizing it in him didn't make it easier to sit with. On the 9th day, she finally walked to what remained of the fence, just a few broken boards and open space now, and found Malachi on the other side, staring at the gap like it owed him an explanation. "I keep telling myself I'm protecting her," he said before Margot could ask anything. "But it's not really about Zuri anymore, is it?" Margot shook her head slowly. "I don't think it ever fully was." He admitted it then, plainly, the way he hadn't let himself admit much of anything since Danielle, that loving someone new felt like agreeing to be breakable again, and some days he wasn't sure he had it in him to survive that twice. Margot didn't offer easy comfort. She'd learned over the past year that easy comfort rarely fixed anything real. Instead, she told him the truth she'd been sitting with for 11 days, that she wasn't asking him to promise forever, because either of them could actually promise that to anyone. She was only asking him to stop deciding the ending before they'd even finished the beginning. Something in that landed differently than anything else she'd said. Malachi had spent 3 years treating love like a debt he couldn't afford to owe again, but Margot wasn't asking for a debt. She was asking for a choice, made new every day, the kind of choice that didn't require certainty, only honesty. He crossed what was left of the fence line without either of them making a plan for it, the broken boards crunching underfoot, and told her that he didn't want to spend one more day pretending the storm hadn't changed anything. Margot's answer was to finally, fully, let her guard down in front of him, not with grand declarations, but with the quiet relief of someone who had been braced for a blow that never came. They spent the next several weeks rebuilding 2 things at once: the physical fence, which Malachi finally repaired properly, this time with an actual gate exactly where the old loose board used to be, and the relationship itself, built more slowly and more deliberately than either of them had built anything before. Zuri treated the new gate as a personal victory, informing anyone who would listen that she had found Miss Margot first. Malachi's sister met Margot at Thanksgiving and texted him afterward with considerably more than a question mark. By the time the first snow came, the gate between the 2 yards stayed open more often than it stayed closed, and neither Malachi nor Margot bothered pretending that was an accident anymore. Spring came the way it always does after a hard winter, gradually, and then all at once. The yard that had sat neglected for a decade before Margot arrived was, by April, full of the flowers she'd planted that first strange, hopeful week, the same bed where Zuri had once knelt in the dirt beside a stranger who would become considerably more than a neighbor. Malachi had kept his promise about the gate. It stood open most mornings, and Zuri had taken to treating both yards as a single continuous kingdom that belonged equally to all 3 of them, which, by that point, it more or less did. The distance of that difficult November was rarely mentioned anymore, except as the kind of story people tell at dinner parties once the hard part is safely behind them. Proof, if anyone needed it, that surviving something together was different from simply not losing it. On the 1-year anniversary of the storm, Malachi did something he hadn't planned carefully, mostly because he'd learned from Margot that some of the best things in his life had arrived without a plan attached. He asked her to meet him at the fence line, their fence line, gate wide open between them, just as the sky was doing that particular deep orange thing it did in early December evenings. She found him standing exactly where the old broken board used to be, and for one suspended second she thought, absurdly, that history might be repeating itself in some new and complicated way. Instead, Malachi held out a small box and told her the truth he'd spent a year learning how to say without flinching, that he wasn't afraid of losing her anymore, because avoiding her had never actually protected him from anything. It had just cost him a year he could have spent choosing her instead. Margot didn't answer with words first. She crossed the last few feet between them the same way she had that stormy December night, without hesitation, without waiting to be certain it was safe. When she finally did speak, her answer was simple, and it echoed something she told him months earlier, back when the fence had still been broken and neither of them had known what to call what was growing between them. "I told you," she said. "The first good thing that happened to me here climbed through a hole in a fence. I didn't think the second one would too." Zuri, watching from the porch with the specific triumphant satisfaction of a child who had orchestrated the entire relationship from the very beginning, informed both of them loudly that she had called this exact outcome months ago, and frankly, someone owed her ice cream. They were married the following autumn, in Malachi's backyard, under the same oak tree that had once nearly cost them a fence, and instead gave them a gate. Zuri, now 8, walked down the aisle scattering flower petals from the very bed she'd helped plant the week Margot moved in, informing every guest within earshot that this had all been her idea. The old cedar fence stood rebuilt and painted, gate open on both sides, no longer a boundary between 2 separate lives but a low, easy line between one shared one. Malachi had spent 3 years believing that protecting himself meant keeping people out. Margot had spent 5 believing that leaving first meant never having to be left. Between them, they'd learned something neither grief nor heartbreak had managed to teach alone: that love, real love, wasn't the absence of risk. It was choosing the risk again anyway, on every ordinary day that followed the extraordinary one. If you've stayed with Malachi and Margot this whole way, thank you, genuinely, for spending this time with us. Tell me in the comments where in the world you watched this one from, and whether you'd have fixed that fence sooner than he did. If you want more stories like this, the slow burn kind, the ones that earn their ending, hit subscribe, and consider joining our membership for shorter, exclusive stories every week with no ads. I'll see you in the next one.